and I'm the, I should probably start again. Good morning and welcome. My name is Shruti Gola-Taraski-Carr, and I am the Director of Race Relations, Equity and Inclusion with the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. It is my deep pleasure today to be here to host this very important discussion. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to recognize the land and the foundation for all of the work that we do at the Commission. Today, we gather in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation, which is governed by the treaties of peace and friendship. Mi'kmaq have made this land their home from time immemorial, and they are its past, present, and future caretakers. Despite this, the pursuit of colonialism resulted in stolen lands, encroachment on sacred territory, cultural genocide, and oppression that served to advance the lives of settlers at the expense of all ill-knew people. It is in the context of this history that the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission seeks to address persistent, systemic, and institutionalized discrimination resulting from the ideals of white supremacy. The Commission's origins are rooted in the work of African Nova Scotians who have been present in Mi'kma'ki for more than 400 years. Rooted in the history of slavery and legislated segregation, African Nova Scotians came together, coordinated, and fought against institutionalized racism, discrimination, and oppression. And this in itself led to the creation of the Human Rights Commission. As we build upon their work together to address the harms of colonialism, we do so in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, drawing upon the resilience and commitment of our forebearers to guide us in this important work, to protect and promote the human rights of Nova Scotians. We recognize the intergenerational impacts of the historic and ongoing injustices against Mi'kmaq people and African Nova Scotians, and the resulting privileges of those who continue to benefit from these offenses. We honor and embrace Mi'kmaq wisdom, such as Msanogama, meaning all my relations. This values the inherent interconnectivity of all things as we strive to foster relationships based on respect for one another's inherent dignity. I invite you all to join in this work with humility and optimism for a better future, Msanogama. So before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. I'd like to highlight that ASL and captions are available throughout today's panel, and that viewers can turn captions on or pin the ASL interpreter as needed. I would also encourage all viewers to submit questions throughout the panel using the Q&A feature along the bottom of the screen. We will be referring to these questions that you submit later on in the panel. As we begin today, today's panel is being held in commemoration of the United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which occurs annually on March 21st. This observance marks the anniversary of a tragic event in history, and it urges us to work towards a world free of racism. In 1960, in Sharpeville, South Africa, peaceful protesters were demonstrating against discriminatory laws known as apartheid. However, instead of listening to their voices, authorities responded with violence. They opened fire on the protesters, killing 69 people and injuring many, many more. This brutal event shocked the world, and it highlighted the urgent need to address racial discrimination. This work continues today, 65 years later. By commemorating this day, we acknowledge that racism persists in our society, even though it may take different forms than it did in the past. It invites us to reflect on our own attitudes and behaviors, as well as the systemic injustices that perpetuate racial discrimination. It is only by recognizing these issues that we can begin to address them effectively. And this is what we're here to do today in today's panel. We need to acknowledge the existence of racial prejudice and discrimination in all facets of our society, including sport, and we need to learn about efforts underway to address it. You know, sports provides a platform where people from diverse backgrounds can come together, promote values like respect, fairness, and inclusion. It can empower marginalized groups, including women, people with disabilities, and other members of equity deserving groups by providing them with opportunities for participation and recognition. Unfortunately, like in all facets of life in Nova Scotia, racial discrimination in sport is a long-standing issue, and it impacts the experience of athletes across all ages and sports. As we begin this panel, I would invite you to listen to the following scenarios, and I would invite you to imagine yourself as a coach or as a player, and reflect upon what you would do if you encountered this situation. The first situation, 3 girls on your team are Black. One of them is your star player. You've developed a great team dynamic, but when you head into your tournaments, you hear other players and coaches talk about your team as aggressive and wild. And when your star player celebrates after scoring, others complain she's showboating and being unsportsmanlike. Another scenario, you overhear your child's coach talking about how wonderful it is to coach a diverse group of kids. You overhear him saying with complete positivity, "It's so great to have a diverse bunch of kids this year. When I was their age, there weren't any Oriental, colored, or Native guys at my club." A young boy joins a sports program and his family is from Pakistan. English is his second language, and he's just beginning to understand more of what people around him are saying. Some of the others are making fun of how he dresses and what he packs as a snack. These are the everyday examples that we can encounter in our lives. And unlike the high-profile experiences of some players, whose stories do garner media attention and result in significant action being taken, racism occurs in all forms, big and small, in communities throughout Nova Scotia. The question is, how are coaches leading by example? How are they supporting an increasingly diverse cohort of athletes? Both Sports Nova Scotia and the Canadian Sports Institute Atlantic have dedicated staff positions supporting coaches and sports organizations to invest in equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. These positions are unique to Nova Scotia, and yes, we are leading the way once again, as we always do. And they reflect the need for changes to how clubs and communities address issues of discrimination, including racial discrimination. But this work requires all of us to be on board if we're truly going to change the game and foster safety and inclusion for all athletes. I am so excited to hear from our panelists, and without further ado, I would like to introduce them. Our first panelist is Sheila Srinivasan Thomas. Sheila holds a Master of Public Administration and Management and has nearly a decade of government experience. A dynamic leader with over 30 years in equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility and leadership, she has driven key initiatives in sport and recreation. As sport and recreation lead at the Department of Communities, Culture, Tourism, and Heritage, she led the Nova Scotia Sport and Recreation Anti-Racism Campaign and co-developed the Women's, Girls, and Gender Diverse in Sports strategy, fostering a community of practice with Canadian women and sport. She has supported Mi'kmaq sports leaders and is a Future Hockey Social Innovation Lab Fellow, advancing female and gender diverse coaching in hockey. Sheila and her husband, Nikhil, raised 2 accomplished daughters excelling in sports and academia. She now serves as program manager at the Status of Women, focusing on gender-based violence prevention, economic security, and women's leadership. Welcome, Sheila. I would like to now introduce Marvin Okello. Marvin Okello is a community activist, a community advocate and activist dedicated to advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion, a sports activist, coach, podcaster, and multi-sports commentator. He uses his platform to drive social change. Since founding the Halifax Wanderers IDEA Committee in 2020, and more recently as the EDIA Coaching Support with CSI Atlantic, Marvin has worked on initiatives that promote diversity, inclusion, equity, accessibility, and address discrimination, drawing from his own personal experiences. Martin believes in the power of collective action and working together for change to create environments for everyone to participate and enjoy sport. So happy that you're with us this morning, Marvin. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, we have Nick Lenahan. Nick's background in sport includes more than 15 years as a high-performance coach, a nationally accredited official, and an NCCP learning facilitator, along with many volunteer roles on boards of directors at various provincial and national organizations, and most recently at the Sport Dispute Resolution Centre of Canada. He currently works at Sport Nova Scotia as the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Lead, a role that he has held since 2021. This role was established to help support the growth of sport across the province through working with community and provincial sports organizations on creating and implementing inclusion plans with a community-first mindset. Welcome, Nick. So I think we will begin our first question, and that question, Sheila, I will direct to you. Sheila, when you hear about the examples of ways that racial discrimination shows up in sports, how does that resonate with you?
It resonates personally. It's a very tough space to receive that kind of experience or to witness family members, community groups experiencing this exclusion. So I take it to heart. It resonates personally. I know that raising my daughters, playing in multiple sport, unfortunately, they did not have the positive experience all the time as they deserved. You know, racism manifests in several ways. It includes a culture of silence. It shows up in complicity amongst athletes, coaches, volunteers, parents, administrators. You know, friendships ends with a justification that dynamics are always changing. These are words that my children have experienced. My daughter's experiences were dismissed. They were made to feel that they didn't belong to the sport or to the club. They even experienced over-sexualization as younger athletes from older athletes. So there's a peer-to-peer dynamic that occurs as well. And this reinforces that feeling of complicity that is being ignored by the adults that are running the program. So the examples that you shared, you know, I take them quite personal. And they manifested differently for my daughters. And the issues extend beyond the club or the organization because we don't live in siloed pillars. Our lives are lived in all facets of Nova Scotia, like you had mentioned earlier. You know, it shows up in school settings, in our neighborhoods, in our community events. And my daughters, you know, were often overlooked and neglected through all these spaces because of incidences that happened in sport towards them. And for many years, while they were engaging in these sport programs, they received very little coaching, often ignored. But, you know, they persisted, perhaps for the love of sport, perhaps their determination, their motivation, their character. They persisted. They wanted to be there. Whether they felt belonging was a different conversation. But eventually they were no longer being ignored. If you're good enough, if you're strong enough, if you compete and you win, at some level, it's hard for coaches to ignore. Now, in no ways am I saying that winning fixes everything. It actually fixes nothing. It actually puts their negative experience on pause just for a moment. And then they're back at the usual cultural space of exclusion. So, some of the examples that my daughters wanted me to share, have taken their permission, um, is how it showed up. Like, what does it look like? Because that seems to be the the question. How does racism show up in sport? What does that look like? It could be, so there was, for one particular space, my daughters have to walk a kilometer from where the bus stop is to the club. 1 kilometer is not long, and it's in a neighborhood, so you would consider it being safe. However, it didn't have a sidewalk, and when the cars were passing by, parents would pass by and not pick them up to help. So, ignoring that these children were also athletes with your children. So that was interestingly, notable that as a parent, I would have probably helped out another parent and pick up their children along the way. And as the kids turned into teens and they learned how to drive cars, then the teenagers were driving and tried to swerve their car to scare my daughters while walking to practice. And that kind of behavior is absolutely unnecessary. Threatening with a car, causing bodily harm, is no space for safety. And so when we took these complaints to the club organization, to the lead administration, and to the coaches, to the head coaches, it was often ignored and dismissed. We were at a loss. We couldn't understand how could even the safety of our children going to practice was being ignored. And these were being ignored by adults. Another example would be athletes taking equipment out of my daughter's equipment pieces. So if they had a boat, missing pieces would be taken away, and that would delay them to head onto the water on a timely manner, and would even shorten their practice on the water because they're looking for spares. So these equipments were being stolen. And when you were asking them to be returned, these athletes would throw them at my daughters with blatant disrespect. Sheer level of disregard and indifference towards my daughters. When we brought this to the coach had actually didn't care, complained that, well, if your daughters wanted to get to practice on time, which they had to walk and avoid being swerved at, and then approach their boat and notice that, things are missing. And it's up to them to get onto the water on time. And I really think that it's more than just the athletes. I think it's the space, providing a safe space where athletes can get there on time, head to practice, and have access to the water or to the space of field like everyone else. And like my children had to grow up very quickly because of the disrespect and disregard and the racism that they received. There was a point, an example where we saw the tides turning of my children leaving childhood.
Yes.
It was at the age of 10. They're still in elementary school. Something had happened on a soccer field, on a pitch, where my daughter went to practice and her teammate was making, terrible comments about other kids playing on the field, that they didn't belong on the field, that they smelled like food, and saying things that were absolutely disrespectful. Commenting on someone's body or figure or skin
Yes.
tone or how they smell or you think how they smell are microaggressions or even overtly macroaggressions,
Yes. Yes.
right? And so when my daughter challenged them, saying, what you're saying is not right, not what you're saying is not kind, and what you're saying can be seen racist. Well, that blew up in my daughter's face, in our face. One parent didn't like the comment and demanded that my daughter to apologize. My daughter's 10,
Mhm.
and everyone gets to learn at the age of 10.
Mhm.
So my daughter chose not to apologize, and we, as a family, supported her
Mhm.
because there was no apology of the other athletes and their behavior. What resulted from that is that we were asked to leave the club. It was over. These are formative years that
Yeah.
my children were growing up. They were being called crazy brown girls during their formative years, that they were too angry. They they did not have the words, but they had the strength to know what's right and what was wrong.
Mhm.
And I'm so proud that, they had that value and that integrity to stand up. But they were standing up alone
Yes.
and essentially were left alone. And seeing that is really still hard to talk about. I
Yes.
we went through it. It was difficult then. I'm sharing it now. It's hard to share
Yes.
because it's personal.
Yes.
My younger daughter, she managed differently. They're 5 years apart. The club that she was at, where this over sexualization was happening from older athletes, so peer-to-peer issues, bullying happening from peer to peer. But what happened was the younger group, it forced them to come together because they were experiencing it together. It forced them to, in some way, find a way to, know that this is a value that they did not agree on, this bullying. And perhaps the parents of those of the younger group, which I believe made a bigger impact of positivity. Because it does matter. This kind of culture comes from somewhere. It comes from your families, from your communities. It's reinforced in schools, it's reinforced in clubs and an organization. And if the families are healthy and the organizations are healthy, then the experience is experienced healthy. And so my younger daughter was able to, you know, have friends growing up in sport, where my older daughter didn't was not afforded that situation. And perhaps the cohort of the older children came from, well, obviously it was different. We experienced it differently. We had two children going to the same club, experiencing the same sport, but one was leaving with a lot less.
Mhm.
Um, but I do find that culture is a difficult shift to change, but it can be done.
Yeah.
We've seen some changes like in coaches, administrators, volunteers, parents, athletes, they all have a part to play in it. And, seeing my younger daughter, a little bit experiencing healthy, happy play because she had friends and allies, um, impacted her in a positive way because they're still friends now. My older daughter, who experienced, isolation, neglect, racism, and just pure bullying, like just mean-spiritedness, didn't get that safety.
Yes.
But yet both my daughters were committed to stay in the space of play. And that tells me something about their resiliency and
Yes.
their love for the space of play. I think, Shruti, my advice is that when you hear these experiences, and even if it doesn't directly impact you, but if you hear it and believe it,
Mhm.
the believing part will impact you to move spaces of inclusion.
Thank you.
If you don't,
Thank you
if
very
you don't
much.
mind if I add there too, Sheila, you've mentioned a couple times that they were alone and they didn't have a lot of supports. I just want to acknowledge that they had you,
Mhm.
and that's really important. And you should give yourself a lot of credit because there's a lot of kids who don't have a role model like you, a parent like you who prioritizes protecting their involvement in sport and ensuring that they have that resilience that you've modeled yourself. And unfortunately, that's not the reality of a lot of kids who are in sport. They don't have, two parents or a parent who cares enough about sport or has the time or capacity or finances to support them in sport. And, they're a lot of them are one and done. They go to one sport, they have one negative experience and they're done, and it's a lot of credit to you for being able to be another support and allowing them not to be alone. So I think it's important just to give yourself some credit.
Thank you. Thank you, Marvin. Yeah.
And
It,
Marvin, you kind of went exactly where my mind was going. Because as a mother of brown girls myself, my daughters have experienced this in sport. And the question I have for you, Sheila, is your story is very similar to mine. And you said it well. They're forced to grow up really quickly. And that's a part of play and sport and childhood that they don't need to know these things so young. And as a mom and as a brown woman, right, we are put in positions of nurturing that early resilience in them, but also nurturing it in ourselves, right, so that we can intervene. Um, it takes its toll. And it takes its toll on everybody. And when we think about racial discrimination, we think about the actual event and the people directly involved, but we also, and thank you for raising it, Marvin, we think about the families and the communities that are impacted as well. You're bringing to life for me a time when my 5-year-old Maya she came to me after practice and she said, that girl, one of her team members said, they can't be my partner because I have brown skin. Now, Maya said this in front of my 3-year-old daughter, Gina. And in that moment, I was faced with, wow, this is that moment where, I have to move and I have to move well, and I have to safeguard their confidence, and I have to not let them feel there is shame, but how am I going to handle this? Right. And in that moment, I think I shared this with you all in the prep for this, but I had my 2 babies in my arms and I said, come on, Maya, Gina, we're going back into the building. And I got the coach and I said, this was just said to Maya, would you mind and doing a little talk with the child and their parent? And thank goodness the coach did it right on the spot. So it was like an impromptu disruption, restorative conversation. And I would think I blanked out because I was in shock, as we do when these things happen to us. You're shamed, your heart is racing. Um, and it worked out well. Like there was a clear denunciation of the act. However, I was left with what do I do with them now?
Mhm.
And so when we went home, the only thing I could do was I put on some Bhangra music. I dressed them up in our traditional clothes and I picked up a cake from the store and we just danced in the living room. And my girls will tell you this because it's like, how do you turn that trauma into a positive thing? The greatest thing for me was, how do I stop this from impairing their confidence and making them grow up too quickly? And I
Yeah.
don't know if I got it right. I don't know if any of us get it right, but I really feel you as a parent of brown girls. We're facing something different.
really shocked by it. I don't know why. Racism is always shocking when it's happening. We know it's there, we experience it, but you always feel shocked. And it's
Yes,
interesting you use the word ashamed. And we're not doing it.
it's not our shame.
And yet we feel it. We don't want to be outed being different.
Yes.
It's I almost, you know, I don't understand when people are not used to seeing people that are not like them. And that's the problem, the lack of tolerance and acceptance. And that's the problem there. And when that persists, they do not believe your voice. They do not believe your experience.
And the
And that's what
culture
my,
of silence and complicity.
yeah,
Yes, Marvin.
that's what my daughter's experienced.
Yes.
True. And Sheila, I was just going to add that it's why it's so important to have, that diversity, and there's a lot of naysayers to this work that say, why is this important? Why are we doing this? Why can't we just get to the field and play sport? Why can't you just shut up and dribble? And these are the reasons why it's important to have that diversity, to have these conversations, because a lot of those people are speaking from a privileged lens.
Yes.
They don't know what they don't know.
Mhm.
And it's it's tough. Gola, you're sharing your experience to remove the humanity from it, the emotion that comes with the feelings of these are my children, and you want to teach them the right tools while also, allowing them to navigate things in their own way, because you're not going to be in every locker room, you're not going to be in every field, you're not going to be in every facet of their life. But it's great that you were able to turn a negative memory and moment into a positive one by dancing and all that. And I think the thing that we always struggle as minorities and is, are we doing it right? And wondering if that was the right thing we did. But that's the burden that we have, is that a lot of times we're not given a playbook,
No.
a guide on here's what you do when this happens. Here's what you, and I think that's a good segue for some of the things that Nick and I do. But
Yes, yes. And let me move. That's beautiful. Moving right on to you, Marvin. Coaches have a very important role. They model acceptable behavior, they manage conflict, and they do address racism in all forms, and they see it. Tell me about your role and tell me about what you're thinking about as you focus on coaching in your role, and what is resonating with you about the conversation, the rich and deep conversation we just had.
well, there's so many overlaps in what you've just shared, Sheila, and thank you so much. And I know it's not easy, and same with you, Gola. But positions like mine and Nick's as well, are those um, roles that are responsible for creating those how-tos, those trainings that will hopefully help, maybe not completely eliminate, but provide coaches and athletes and administrators and those who are involved in sport with the tools for how to act when these things happen. Like you gave that great example, Goal of the person who stepped up, acknowledged the situation, pretty much nipped it in the bud as quickly as possible. Those are the things that myself and Nick are involved in. You also talked about modeling acceptable behavior, managing conflict, addressing racism. There are already tools in things like the NCCP, the National Certification Program, and the Locker, that they have modules that address those things. There's this one series of 4 modules that I really, really think is well done that addresses modeling healthy relationships, understanding teen dating violence, bystander empowerment,
Yes.
gender-based violence in sport. Those are the how-tos and the context that's provided without having to go to the field and see how things are done negatively and how impact people negatively. Racism in sports, there's a module on that. So my role is really meant to, in some ways, not recreate the wheel, but to guide people towards what are those trainings. My role is to foster partnerships and relationships with non-traditional partners that maybe sometimes we forget about in sport, like the Human Rights Commission, and having conversations like we're having today, and thinking about what are those other organizations that can be allies in this work.
Yes.
Um, my job is to navigate representation through my own experiences, like we talked about, seeing is believing, and making sure that I'm adding to that representation. So, when your daughters are show up at the club, Sheila and Gola, that they're not the only ones, because we've pulled other people into the program by acknowledging that we have the right coaches who are going to support them when things come up. We have the right culture, or we're working towards the right culture that's going to make sure that they at least experience those things less. Again, I can't say that they're never going to experience that, because racism is learned, and we don't know who's going to show up at each club based on how they were raised at home. um, and it's using my own networks, which I'm privileged to have a lot of large networks with, working with organizations like the Wanderers, and being involved in the Canada Games as an athlete myself, 20 years ago, and being I've played at the club level, the community level with things like Halifax Sport and Social. I've played at a national level, going to tournaments where I've experienced my own racism and experienced the lack of processes and that they had in those moments, like we discussed leading up to this conversation. So that's one of my roles, and then it's also to create environments for that learning. We have programs that were created, again, not recreating the wheel, like the Black Indigenous Coaching Mentorship Program, which was started by Mark Smith and Ann Dodge. And it's pulling more people into that program, recognizing that we need a bridge between community sport and high performance sport. And we also need to recognize that it's okay if some people just stay in community sport, because I think there's this kind of false stigma in sport that everyone wants to be involved in high performance sport, and it's debunking that myth, and recognizing that there's some people who just want to play, and
Yes.
and that's okay.
Yes.
Not everybody wants to go to the world championships, the Olympics, or whatever. Maybe I just want to go have fun with my friends, with my girlfriends, with my wife. You know what I mean? Like, that is okay. And we facilitate, you know, the the culture that makes sure that everyone, from administrators to recruiters to all those involved in sport, are understanding that, we have to ask kids what they want. We have to
Yes.
ask athletes what they want, and then it's our job to facilitate that. It's not trying to push people in directions they don't want to be in, push people to be in uncomfortable situations that they don't want to be in, you know, whether they're Black, whether they're queer, whether they're an immigrant, whether they're born and raised here. It doesn't matter, or I should say it does matter, but we have to ask them what they want and then fulfill that need and create those safe spaces, and Nick is somebody who, I'm proud to work with, and as an ally, and in providing different contexts, because our lived experiences are all very different, and it's important to acknowledge those differences and to work together, because ultimately my experience is only one as a Black male, and I can learn and understand and sympathize and empathize what Nick's experience might have been in sport, or Sheila's or Gola's or anybody else's that I work with or have engaged with. But it's not my job to speak on their behalf, in certain rooms. It's to bring them to the room and support in them feeling comfortable and safe to talk about their experiences. So that's a lot of what my role is bringing those people together, creating those safe spaces, and being a safe person, which I think is often forgotten. Is, safe spaces are great, but if there's not a person there that you can look to in the room when you're nervous, and when you get that knot in your stomach when you realize, oh my gosh, there's a lot of eyes and ears on me, that is really important. And I can comfortably say that I'm blessed with those tools of vulnerability, and allowing people to also feel vulnerable, because when Michelle Obama came here, that was one thing that really stuck with me, was vulnerability encourages vulnerability. I put an exclamation point on that in my 3 pages of notes that I wrote down when I got to experience her being here. And even though, there were some hurdles thrown her way with the moderation of the discussion, there was a lot of apples that were placed there. And so that's some of my roles in this in this job that I have, and in bringing people together, and also learning from folks like Nick and Sheila, Gola, and Natasha's and my director and my pillar, and a lot of credit to her for creating a safe space and environment for me, and Allison as a coworker, and our whole team at CSI, and the EDIA team that works with Nick, and working together to not feel like we're alone in this work, because you know that was my experience in sport, unfortunately, was that I was sometimes the only black male on the team, the only black coach, the only EDIA staff, the only whatever it might be, and it's to make sure that I'm bringing people with me, and creating space for others to join the work and be a part of the work. And I don't know if I missed anything, Nick, there in terms of what I do. Feel free to add anything there.
You're doing a fantastic job of explaining a lot of what's happening in the system, Marvin. I think you're doing a great job explaining it all.
Marvin, I was struck by one thing you said, and that was particularly your own experience as an athlete. And can you help us? And Steve, we're seeing all of this through our own unique lenses and our own unique stories and positionalities and social locations, which is so different. Mine is so different than yours, than Sheila's, than anybody else's. In those moments where you directly rubbed up against discrimination, overt, unconscious, conscious, straight up, whatever it was, what did you need in order to move through that? And I think that is kind of where I always go. Like, if we can get a sense of what people need in those moments, it'll help inform coaches, other athletes. Like, what was the fundamental need?
I mean, you actually addressed it. I don't know if you realize you did, but it's what you saw happen with your daughter's team, and somebody quickly coming in and addressing the situation.
Right, right,
Somebody being an ally that removes the burden from you as a parent, for the one to have to do that, because it's not your job as a parent when you show up to support your child to protect them. It's the coach's responsibility, it's the official's responsibility, it's those who are working in sports responsibility. So, in the moments that I've had in racism in sport, and I've been very vocal about those on podcasts and whatnot, and that's maybe the one thing that I forgot is creating opportunities for people to learn about these things before they start poking people and asking the wrong questions, or asking people to do the learning for them, going to their black friends and saying, educate me about your experience, and that's why it's important to have things like podcasts where they can tune in and listen and go, oh, I didn't realize all of that.
yeah,
But to go back to your question, what I needed is allies in the moment, in the line of fire, when somebody calls me the N-word, it's having a coach who
mm,
holds the ref accountable for his lack of action. When I'm asked to leave the field of play after as a victim, called the N-word on a soccer field, and a ref asked me and the other player to leave the field of play, and I'm looking over at my coach and my team like, is this what we're doing? This is what we're accepting as a course of action. We don't have a process for this. And me
right.
as a 16-year-old boy who's just trying to play
Hmm.
and have fun on the soccer field and compete like all the other, white kids are. I needed an ally to step up. I needed a leader to step up and say, I support Marvin, and this isn't right. He did nothing wrong. He should stay on the field.
Yeah,
That kid who said the N-word should leave the field, but
yes.
Marvin did nothing wrong.
Hmm.
So for me, that's why this work is so passionate to me. It's so dear to my heart. And you look in my apartment, like this is my life. This isn't something that I preach about. and I go to work and I do a 9 to 5 and I leave. And it doesn't, this is 24/7. This is my reality. This is a lot of people's reality. So what we need is more allies.
I agree.
And
Like what we need, that's the action part. This is the issue. What I needed for my daughters is the coach telling the kids, knock it off and stop swerving your car, or you don't get to practice and we'll boot you out of the club. I don't know. So maybe some strong actions. What I needed was for my daughters to be respected daily from their peer groups and from their coaches. What I needed was my daughters to be able to safely play and pursue the sport and do well with it and learn more. That's what they needed. That's what I needed. Um, I didn't have a coach that would go to the athletes and say what you did was wrong on behalf of my kids. I think that was the very first simple step that ought to have been done, was to have a conversation. The action is really addressing, that's the perfect question, Shruti, is what do you need?
Mhm.
Well, when people come with these issues, they need a response, an
Yes.
actionable response.
Agreed,
And
Sheila, because if somebody had asked me on that day what I needed, I would have told them to stay on the field. I need to stay on the field and I need you to help me do that because
Yes.
I did nothing wrong,
that's
and as much as I'm willing to be vulnerable and share my experiences on podcasts and panels and whatever it may be, and um, it's exhausting.
yeah,
We need more allies and people who are in positions of power and in position, have privileged opportunities because they don't have to experience this on a day to day to
yes.
be able to step up and remove the burden from us as minorities and those equity seeking folks and marginalized folks that are burdened with this every day, you
It's
know.
everyone's responsibility, as you say,
It
but
is.
this
And just
culture
one
of
thing I'm gonna
silence. Yes.
Yeah, there's
And
one thing
like,
I'm going to add before we transition. Sorry, Sheila, is,
oh, go ahead.
I recently, met with the Future of Sport Commission when they came here and they were asking for people to step up to share those experiences. And I love that that work is being done, and recently got an email from them in terms of what the next steps are. And there was a really, powerful statement that they made in terms of what's happening next. And it was the Honorable Stephen Guilbeault, the Minister of Canadian Culture and Identity at Parks Canada, who put this statement that sports builds communities, it stimulates economies, and contributes to the overall well-being of Canadians and the country. However, without sufficient safeguards and accountability, sport can also do harm. And that's why the government of Canada is working to build a safe, inclusive, and welcoming sports system so that Canadians can experience the transformative power of sport. So they're an independent commission. They can gather information, they can try and hold people accountable, but it's folks like Sheila, Nick, and I who are the boots on the ground, who are actually, 1 degree of separation away from the coaches, from the administrators, from those who work in sport to actually hold them accountable for what they're doing and not doing lip service, not doing box check exercises, but actually doing things that are going to impact the culture of sport in a positive way.
I, Marvin, I think that's great. I would add, the question's always asked to the athlete that is experiencing racism and discrimination, is to ask the coaches, what are you hearing? And what are you doing? How are you responding? And if coaches and administrators and volunteers are saying that they're not hearing anything, I'm suspicious if they're listening. And I would also question, are you not hearing because no one's coming to you? And why is that?
Mhm,
Mhm.
mhm.
Because kids have something to say.
Yes.
Yeah, because you can be an innocent bystander once. You can't be an innocent bystander twice, 3 times, and 4 times and claim that you're part of the solution, right? Like, yeah, it's hard and there's fear to navigate and it's difficult, but that's how true change happens, right?
Yes.
And we have to we have the burden of having to do it every day, like I've mentioned. But it's to anybody who's watching this and listening and goes, it's taking a good look in the mirror about what you've been involved in as a bystander and the lack of action that you had when you saw those things.
Excellent point. And Nick, Sports Nova Scotia does partner with communities uh, in its programs to address discrimination. What are you reflecting on as you hear the rich conversation you're just having?
Um, Quite a lot. And I think when this work really started in a like strategic, purposeful way for us, um, there was this instinct that we needed to work directly with community and directly with the non-sports community and try to figure out, the sports system is built a certain way for a certain type of participant. What about that is keeping you from being involved? And I think a lot of this has been um, traditionally the sports system has been serviced to service our quote unquote members, where, you know, and this is across Canada, across North America, across the world. The sports system in anywhere is built to service clubs and organizations in sport, which makes a lot of sense. But this work was started with trying to get outside of that system and start to ask the questions and really challenge, why are we doing things the way we're doing them? Traditions should be challenged. The status quo should be challenged. Questions should be asked. Why is practice the way it is? That's a legitimate question that can be asked. Why is it happening at this time of day? Um, why do we break for certain holidays and others? And my child is reprimanded for missing practice because it's their own holiday. Like these sorts of things should be questioned. And what we've done is, and one of the things that Sport Nova Scotia has now is a specific EDIA community funding stream. And one of the requirements of that funding is actually that we applicants must have a community organization like a cultural association or a community group partnering with a sport organization to come together and uh, put a grant application in to do a program or to get equipment or to run something specific. And like I said, this was all done instinctually at the beginning, but then we recently had a researcher reach out and say that is actually a kind of a unique requirement for a funding stream that you need essentially two groups to
Right.
come together. And so he evaluated it. We committed to saying, you know what? If you want to research into this, we will help you, give you the data, you can do the research. And we also committed to say, depending on what your recommendations are, we'll take. Like if you end up recommending that this partnership isn't worthwhile, we'll look at changing it. But what he came back with was, no, this does create better, more sustainable, more long-term.
Oh, I think we've lost your audio, Nick. Yeah,
10 seconds ago.
just
No, still can't hear you
not
there.
yet. Okay, Nick, we're gonna come back to you. Um, oh, now?
Can you
No.
hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know what just happened there, but
Oh, good.
I'm sorry for that. I apologize. What I was going to say is our researcher came back and showed that the partnership requirement has led to better programming that although it is an additional sort of administrative barrier to bring two people together or two groups together, um, it does create better experiences for the end user. And what we noticed as well was it's also in how we've created that requirement. We have staff people, regional sport consultants, and navigators. We have people across the province that work for Sport Nova Scotia whose roles are to help find potential partners. So if somebody comes forward and says, I have this idea, but I don't have the other side of the equation,
Right.
we can then help them find the other side of the equation. So that's really the idea of trying to build from the community standpoint and say, what does sport need to look like for you? And maybe it needs to be something that's a standalone and unique and different and new, and that's okay. But what does it look like, and how can we create the relationships so that communities that traditionally don't feel comfortable in sport um, get an experience but we're also educating the sort of generic traditional sports system on how to create more inclusive spaces so that when people do come to you, um, you know how to be actually welcoming and not just nice. Like
Right.
there's a difference. One of my favorite kind of quotes is we're Maritimers. We're very good at being nice. We're not very good at being kind. And I
Yeah.
think kindness is sometimes being uncomfortable. It means challenging things. It means valuing the fact that you might be uncomfortable and you might put yourself out there, and that's okay. But I would really say that, that difference between being nice and being kind is really I think where a lot of us need to get to as we continue to do the work.
Totally
And
agree, Nick.
yeah, and the sense of community responsibility, it's everyone's responsibility to
Mhm.
raise issues, not just the people that are being affected, right? And if
Yeah.
we can get into this kind of approach, then it's our community protecting its own community
Hmm.
rather than
And I'd
individual.
also add that it's like the intersectionality of when you're being kind or nice, but being honest and transparent about it. There's this one thing I struggle about, Canadian culture, and maybe it's North American, but like this like false niceness and around like, you know, we make statements that we don't actually mean, like inviting people to do something with us that we actually don't want to do with them because we're being nice. But in your heart, you're like, I don't actually want them to come to my house, but like, I could tell that they were going through a tough time. So I threw it out there, hoping that they wouldn't actually say yes to that invite. Right. Like being transparent about what you can actually do and looking inside, and because sometimes you can do more harm. Because like, what if that person does say yes and they do show
Well,
up at your home?
and I think that kind of goes back to a lot of what um, was reached earlier was like how to be an ally and like being an ally. But I think part of what we try to do and part what I try to do is we have to teach people what that means and what that actually looks like. And that being an ally probably won't be easy. And that's okay. And if you feel like it's easy, you're probably not doing a very good job of it.
It's going to require something of you, your
Yes.
discomfort, your self-learning, not to
Yeah.
rely on other people to teach you.
Yeah. And I think it's also letting people know that it's natural to be averse to conflict.
Yes.
We tend to be naturally averse to conflict. And as white people in a white dominant society, it is really easy for us to be comfortable in settings where
Mhm.
people look like us. It's easy for us to not speak up or not put our necks out there to advocate for somebody else because we risk creating conflict for ourselves. That's
Yes.
the easy way out. And that's, I think, why when we say being an ally means being uncomfortable or being or disrupting and really being honest with yourself is knowing that being an ally might mean that you say something to somebody that you've known for 20 years and you have to call them out for something that they've done wrong and standing up for somebody that you don't know at all. And it means that situation might happen. And it will probably happen over and over again, especially in a sports setting that is, you know, depending on the sport, it's very small communities. Like if you're a
Mhm.
coach in some sports, you've known the same people for a very long time. You've probably spent more time with some of them than your own family. So you need to, like, it's a harder conversation to have, but it doesn't mean it's not worth having.
And the
Yeah, and
risk
you
of
might.
being excluded if you speak up, that's
Yeah.
something
Yes,
that's new, right?
Right.
Hmm.
that's what
And
I was
so
gonna
I
say,
was going
Gola,
to
is
add, like, it's a lonely space.
It's very lonely.
It's a lonely space. However, there are communities of allies, and who you are allying for is already a lonely person.
Hmm.
So that shared space does not have to be lonely.
That's privilege,
Mhm.
isn't it? To not have to
Hmm.
be lonely and to not have to take a risk, right?
Yeah, and you might lose friends, right? Like, and it's being okay with that, because you can't do the right thing and also support somebody who needs support and also keep your friends,
It's
right?
not
Like there's
popular.
you can't have your cake and eat it too with a lot of these situations. Like unfortunately, there is a quote unquote black and white. You can't live in that gray. You have to either do the right thing and call out, that racism, that sexism, that misogyny, or whatever is happening in the moment to support somebody, to truly support somebody when they need it, while also being okay with the fact that you might lose that neighbor, that friend, that coworker as support, whatever, but you're doing the right thing ultimately.
So this brings us to our final question. And before I pose it, I'd like to invite our audience to think about what's coming up for you and share those questions in the chat. We'll be reviewing those shortly. But what's next for us? What more needs to be done to eliminate racial discrimination in sports in Nova Scotia? And what advice would you have for a coach or an athlete, right, that would help them make this real in their own lives? And just open it up to we begin with Sheila and then we'll just go where we go. Yes.
I can't state it enough. It's listening and believing. And then what will you do next? There's that commitment. So you shared a wonderful example of your daughter and the comment, and the coach listened, believed, and then actioned immediately. It sounds very oversimplified, those 3 steps. And I know there's a lot of journey and bravery that needs to happen. But when a child is coming to you, sharing an experience, and you don't believe the child, what are you representing to that child? What message do you really want to convey? This is not my problem. Then be transparent and say, I'm not the coach for you. Are you afraid of repercussion when you say that? Of course. So then be the other coach, be the better one. Be the one that believes and actions that you're right, this should not have happened. I'm going to try to fix this. I'm going to bring this up. And then that athlete can just be the athlete and can be a person, can be a child, can be a girl, can be all the things that that person is, rather than a racialized, unwanted person.
They can just play.
Let them
Isn't it about
play.
play?
Let them play.
Let them play.
And protect that play.
Yeah. Thank you, Sheila. Nick or Marvin, anything you're thinking about right now in terms of advice or what we need to do?
Go ahead, Nick.
Oh, okay. I mean, Marvin talked earlier about the education for people on how to how do we create spaces? How do we act? How do we support? I also think big part is giving people the language to have conversations about these things. There's terms and language changes and there's more nuance, and until coaches out there and people in positions of authority have the tools to even talk about it,
Right.
it doesn't matter what all the next steps are. So I think part of it is understanding that there's going to be a learning curve. It doesn't excuse anything, but part of the change process is we have to give people the tools to evaluate their own behavior, talk about what's happening, ask the right questions, be there for others in a meaningful way. And I'd say the other one is any stereotype in sport that comes to race is racism. And I think too often people have this idea that, oh, well, black sprinters are faster than white sprinters. That's a positive stereotype out there. But any stereotype means that you're devaluing somebody down to the way that they look.
Right.
So I would say in sport, we have a lot of these sort of, depending on the sport that we're in, the way that you look or your body type, the color of your skin, where you come from means you're automatically better at the sport or worse at the sport. And even if you think it's somehow a positive comment, if it's a stereotype about the way somebody looks and they show up, you've already devalued them down to that part of them, which is the basis of racism, and it gives the excuse for people to do it in what could be more harmful ways moving
Excellent.
forward.
Excellent point, Nick.
Well said, Nick. honestly, yeah, just to jump on that, it's you basically um make it you normalize that behavior, right? And other people might hear that and go, "Oh, okay, so he said that. Now I can say this other thought that I had that's a stereotype or a microaggression or, something because well, they said that and nobody said anything." And that's often what happens is somebody says something as harmless, quote unquote, as that, and then somebody else adds a little bit more, stretches it a bit, and all of a sudden racism's now acceptable,
Right.
right? So I think it's really important, what you just said, Nick, and navigating your own biases, both conscious and unconscious, and really working on your self-awareness. I can't tell you how many adults, both I play and sport with, also work with, who are just not self-aware, who don't understand how things they're saying and doing, regardless of their intent. And we've all learned, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, how it's landing. Your intent might be good, or your intent might be harmless, but how is what I'm saying and doing impacting? How is it landing with those I'm saying it to? I've been very vocal with those in my office and other offices about things like hair,
Yes.
making comments about hair. I'm 36 years old and I've been afraid most of my life to get cornrows because I'm afraid of the racism that I'll get from people. And that, unfortunately, I got them during African Heritage Month for the first time ever, and that fear was realized immediately, not hours, not not days, hours after I got them from friends, even making very backhanded compliments around, you're too gangsta now to be in certain rooms or for the white people. And it's like, what? And I say that because I've had the conversation with a friend and he knows how it landed with me and how, yeah, it was harmless comment, but it then actually made me fearful again all over after I got, the corners done about, oh, so this was a real fear that I had. This is actually happening, right? And then it was another thing that I had to navigate.
Yes.
Um,
That's such a
so
great example. How many times do we curate parts of ourselves, put away parts of ourselves, so that it's more palatable, acceptable, because of people will say something. If I wore a bindi, which is part of our tradition, I just grew up not wearing one, right? But I could. And am I courageous enough to wear one? Not really, not unless I'm at a social function, right? So
and
yes, we put away parts of ourselves.
I want to address one of the questions that Rhonda Johnson asked in the chat there, while also saying what's next and what more needs to be done to eliminate racial discrimination in sports Nova
And
Scotia, kind of in
actually,
this.
before we go there, let's
Okay.
I was going to ask your permission to just go in order. We have such a few very important questions, and I think we're on time, and I want to create some opportunity. So maybe we'll just go through the questions in order, Marvin.
Sounds good.
And the first one is this is from a person. I have a question about sports complaint processes. When the complaint that is filed is itself racist, I've twice been involved in a process where I was asked to investigate or adjudicate over a complaint that was ultimately dismissed because the complaint itself was racist.
I'll let you take this one first, Nick. I see you
Yeah,
nodding your head.
I am interested to hear from the panelists on suggestions you have for people in the role of receiving those types of complaints. Some kind of preliminary review that prevents those complaints from being investigated. So the complaint itself was racist. Any thoughts from anyone about this?
Yeah, so I'd say in the sport world, um, the independent sort of third party investigation complaint process is relatively new. Um, at the national level, there is a kind of an established process. At the sort of provincial and local level, it is very, very new, and there is one that is currently being rolled out that I think will give a lot of clarity to what to expect for anybody kind of making the complaint through the sports system. And I'm understanding this as a complaint that maybe came outside of the direct sports system. But I know normally the the default is to not evaluate um, sort of all of the credibility of a complaint when it comes in. But I think the resolution or the process that can be governed from that point is what we're seeing now, at least the third party mechanisms in the sports system are more of a reliance on mediation very early on and actually having that conversation early where you can get a little bit more of a sense of, is this actually a valid complaint, or is this somebody coming forward with ulterior motives? Um, and the other thing is, I know there's under the sort of like the Universal Code of Conduct Against Abuse and Maltreatment in Sport, the acronym is UCCMS. Um, there's some more provisions in there around like it's actually a violation of the code to file a false complaint. So for somebody to complain and it comes out that it was completely fabricated, they themselves have then breached the code and they are now could be the subject of the complaint. So I don't know if there's a lot to prevent that initial filing, but there are definitely more and more mechanisms being put in place to help make sure that um, if it is seen as being frivolous or just outright wrong, and that it can be dealt with appropriately.
And so I'm assuming that there is, of course, a level of, well, obviously procedural fairness.
Yeah.
So the right to respond and the right to see the allegations against a specific person.
Yeah.
And so that would necessarily be a part of any process. I think that is made available.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Marvin, I'm going to jump to the next question because I think you've got the answer for this one. How much training do the coaches receive before they can have the responsibility of coaching young people?
There's some that are required across all sports, and those are things like, making ethical decisions, rule of two, and things like that. And it is different for every sport. I'll use, volleyball as an example, who's gone even further in terms of making sure that those basic requirements have a lot more of that, anti-racism in terms of gender equity and things like that. So it is sports specific. But what I always say to anybody who is wondering about how much training you should receive, there's two answers. First, look at yourself again. What am I actually just naturally good at? What have I already learned maybe through other HR training, other work training, whatnot? And if there's things that you are already pretty comfortable with, don't do those first. Do some of the ones that you're not as familiar with. Maybe it's gender violence in sport. Maybe it's something more rigorous like safe sport. Maybe it's just something that's unfamiliar to you, right? So take a good look at yourself and make sure that you're actually coming in with the right level of understanding, whether it's emotional intelligence, because we're working with athletes and there's power imbalances and things when you're as a coach. Um, and then once you have an idea of what the gaps are in your own kind of knowledge and training, then seek out that additional training, regardless of what your sport mandates that you take, such as, making ethical decisions, rule of two, yada yada. So it's not always based on like, what am I being made to do? But it's asking yourself, what can I do that will then protect myself and my athletes, and ensure that when a situation, like I said, where an athlete is being asked to leave the field of play as a victim of something, that you're able to properly support them and stand up, and also hold those people like the officials or those on the field who are making those negative decisions accountable for their part they're playing in increasing the inclusion and the divide that ultimately makes people stop playing sport. You know, we have the data, especially around girls. You know, 70% of them stopping sport by 17. These are the reasons why. You know, and we can have a whole other conversation about all the other reasons, but it's making sure that you're looking in the mirror, evaluating what audience am I coaching? You know, is it children? Because there's children specific courses and modules you can do. Is it adults? Is it girls? Is it boys? Is it a combination? Do I have a trans athlete in my group? I need trans specific training. And
Yes.
then fulfilling that training based off of the actual audience and the athletes that you're serving.
I would also like to add that there are modules available um, for athletes as well as parents of how racism shows up. And then like what does action allyship looks like. So I also think, if we are signing up athletes, the first, week would be like everyone responsible, maybe doing the training together. It's a 20-minute online listening, learning, and understanding, and then having a conversation that the coach and the administration can lead. And then one with parents, so that way the parents are on board, getting this foundational education, understanding that, it is complex, but this is how it looks like. And having that group conversation, because it's just not enough to have the training and then go on with your own without disseminating it with other people. Part of the learning is understanding and talking it out. So there are trainings for athletes and parents that ought to be involved in this whole narrative.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move on. We have very important questions here. I am a coach player, and have a brown-skinned daughter playing sports in a rural community school. There is a lot of racism in the school that the administrator believe doesn't exist, and so this allows them to not have to deal with it. Are these resources, supports, and tools discussed here today predominantly available in HRM or throughout Nova Scotia broadly? Is this something that people can access?
So most of what we're talking about today are online, free, or very low cost modules. Um, a lot of the in-person sort of sessions that Marvin or I would do are focused on sort of that community sport, provincial sport, national sport system, which this school sport actually sits completely outside of and in the Department of Education. So we have these trainings that are available and are very important for school sport environments that would definitely be useful in school sport environments. But the school sport as an institution, as a system, is a very separate one from the one that the three of us have worked in.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
And maybe that's where the commission can step in with more targeted education, right?
Mhm. And I mean, and just to add to that, you know, there are overlaps, you know, like I've been privileged to go to specific schools across the HRM and talk to some of like the O2 coordinators, some African student support workers who I know are also coaches, you know, and that's where the overlap is. And they see the value in some of these NCCP modules and things as being some of that education they can do, recognizing that, as Nick said, school sport isn't in our mandate, but it's okay to share those resources that we have, like the locker and CCP training, to provide any gaps that there might exist in some of the supports within the school sports system.
Yes, thank you. So the next question, as Marvin mentioned, there are so many resources in terms of coach training via NCCP, the locker, CAC, but so few know about these. Take the courses and truly learn. So many coaches say that they just want to coach the sport and not be a psychologist. How do we shift mindset, encourage unlearning and learning, support coaches to get to a critical mass of coaches, administrators, so that there is an actual sea change of culture and understanding, to normalize and model the allyship upstandard behavior that I think we've been talking about? This is big work that happens at personal levels as well as organization and societal. What are your thoughts, panel members, on how we do this over time in a supportive manner, yet also hold people accountable? Supportive, but accountability.
Personally, I think we I think we have I think number one is we take a step back and recognize that most coaches are volunteer. So I think we have to educate, and there's a lot of support that goes into this because it is very easy to see that many coaches have a similar role in our children's lives as their teachers at school. One of those is a paid position, one of those is a volunteer position. So I think our expectations on the coaches need to be there, but need to be very focused on what is appropriate for them. So I think I agree with the comment. It's an easy cop out to say, well, I'm not a psychologist, but there is training there that needs to be done to help give people the tools. But I think also as a society, we need to realize that if you're expecting the coach as the only person to be the one that can um, navigate or be the key holder of all this sea change, it's not going to happen. They're going to leave the sport because they're going to be burnt out by all the expectations of everybody on them as a singular individual. So I think part of it is recognizing, I think Sheila and Marvin and Shruti, you all said this earlier, that this is a community thing. This means all of the parents of the kids on the team have to be on the same page. The athletes themselves need to be getting this education. The coaches, the administrators, the officials, everybody needs to get the education and to be held accountable and to feel like they have responsibility in the environment to push the change forward. So I think that's how and I think as coaches, if a coach in any given sport can see that this is happening and everybody's moving forward, suddenly there isn't that I'm the only person, it all falls to me. I have no support system. Because for so many coaches, that's kind of part of the feeling is I'm just here. I have no extra time. The training I have is for this, and I'm not being paid to be here. So I think there's probably a balance there, and I think the the base requirements of training that needs to be done for a coach are okay. And over time we continue to add things to it. But I think it really is having that community mindset that everybody in the organization has responsibility in this space. And if we're in this mindset that it's the coach that is the leader and therefore they're the one that has to take it on themselves only, we're not going to see this sea change that we're hoping for.
Coaches are human too, and
Mhm,
they have responsibilities and pressures as well.
mhm,
And so when we are trying to humanize all the way around, let's really think about what their capacity is as individuals as well. And this kind of, I'm going to skip the next question and come back to it because the final question we have is, we require all volunteers to take MED, Med, and Save Sport, but can't get them to commit to them as they only want to help out. How do we get them to buy into it? And I think you've answered that, Nick. It's not about their buy-in, it's about the community.
mhm.
Really setting that expectation and then offering that support to help them get there in a way that works. And
Uh,
this is kind of really going into the last question. I think we're all living off the same brain today. The question is around e-module based training formats. And the questioner asks, what are your opinions of online module based formats? And do you think shifting professional development training back toward a more human-centered, rehumanizing approach to coach development through in-person virtual training with a real human would impact the effectiveness? Do you think e-module based formats are as effective? And is there a reason that this is often the most used format to train coaches? Big question.
Sheila, you want to jump on that first, or?
I think there's value of a combination of in-person as well as online. I think we have to make sure that we remain accessible with this information. So, you know, in-person can be very difficult for many communities to attend, whether it's if it's distance or other issues that are impacting their way of coming in. I think it's really important to have that what happens after the learning, right? And then that's the breakout sessions, that's talking it out, that's working with other coaches, maybe a coach to coach or a peer-to-peer conversation network needs to happen where you're sharing best practices or sharing terrible situations and scenarios, and you need to reach out of like, how do we manage this? We are a community. Sport is not an isolated space. Our athletes and our volunteers, coaches, administrators, they live with us. We interact with them in other spaces outside of sport. So this issue and scenario of racism doesn't just stay on the field. It's carried with you everywhere you go. So online, in person, both are valuable. I think hybrids are important. And I think it's also the need of the coaches and the administrators. What do they need? Do they prefer it? Then we go to them.
If I can just add to that, sometimes it's just capacity. There's not, unfortunately, a huge pool of facilitators to go in person and offer those trainings. And then even if there are, now Nova Scotia has a lot of regions, and unfortunately, not every region has those facilitators. So a lot of them end up coming from the HRM and traveling to Cape Breton, to Yarmouth, to all these regions. And the reality is that it costs time and money. So starting with those e-modules is really beneficial, and then also taking advantage of things like my coworker Allison does these great roundtables across the region, and similarly, some of my coworkers at Sport Nova Scotia, Maddie McDonald, Annie, and Nick, and others go into community and offer things like community engagement sessions, which I partner with them sometimes. Like we recently went to Sheet Harbor, Musquodoboit. We hold them in North Preston in community. So one thing I encourage, I think it was Nicole who said that, is to attend some of those things and send people that could value from those community engagement sessions to participate. Because not only are they for coaches, but they're for people who work in sport. We frame them as coach engagement sessions and things, and I know language is important, but others are always welcome to attend. I love when I see sometimes a teacher, who cares about their students and maybe wants to get involved in sport, and they're thinking about it, so they show up and they learn. And that's some of those in-person opportunities, in community opportunities that you can take advantage of. And feel free to follow CSI and Sport Nova Scotia to see what those opportunities are, because we do kind of two series of these community engagement sessions in the spring and in the fall, to actually go and meet people where they're at and find out what are your barriers, what's happening here, how can we support, and then sometimes it's pointing them to some of those e-learning modules that are relevant, but sometimes it's having facilitating conversations in person as well, which we're always happy to do if there's an appetite there. So don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll try to meet you where you're at.
Thank you, Marvin. And we are just 3 minutes away from closing. And I just want to remind everyone listening, if you feel that you've been the target of racial discrimination, please contact the commission and we can help potentially and support you through that. And in the last few minutes, my question to panel members is, where can people find more about the work that you're doing? What are the resources and your organizations? What are your websites? Where can we go?
So I think we should also include like showuptospeakup.ca. There's wonderful resources that was created by Sport Nova Scotia, Recreation Nova Scotia, CSI, and our fans with government support. There's learning modules. There's who to contact when, connecting through government, connecting to other community resources. So that's a really good start.
I agree completely, Sheila. I was gonna say the showuptospeakup.ca website is the great first hub. And then, like Marvin said, if you follow Sport Nova Scotia and CSI Atlantic on different social media channels, you will definitely see kind of those community and educational opportunities and get a pulse of, what's happening, what are stories from community. Because I mean, we've talked a lot today about what can go wrong, But I think
Yeah.
a big part of our job is we're trying to highlight also what's been going right.
Right.
And that's where you'll start to see some more of those stories of, okay, here are examples of things that are starting to turn the corner.
Yes.
And I just like to add, there's a few things we obviously have on our CSI website, but for those who maybe aren't on social media, we also have a YouTube page for CSI because I know that, there's a lot of people leaving social media because it's another kind of platform where there's a lot of racism and discrimination. But there are things like Show Up to Speak website, which doesn't require you to have a social media account. We have CSI has a YouTube page, and I also do the podcast as another easy resource that you can, listen and learn while you're in the car driving to work or driving to coaching. Here are some of the things that high performance coaches and community coaches are experiencing in their sport and in their personal and professional lives, to kind of get a little bit of that context. And then that might be a great way to then figure out what is my next step. So it's a coach's idea podcast is the one that I have. And that's on all platforms except for Apple, unfortunately, at this point.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that, I wanted to just thank you all for the rich discussion today. I think we did exactly what we hoped to accomplish today. This is the first in a series of conversations that we're going to have with the sports community. This is not over, people. We are entering into this topic. And thank you to the audience members who submitted questions. It just helped us go to a more deep place. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.